In the grand ballrooms of Regency London, the moonlit gardens of France, the sun-kissed villas of Italy, and the passionate streets of Spain, love has always found a way. Here, we bring you original historical romance stories, filled with passion, sacrifice, and unforgettable destinies. Before tonight's tale begins, don't forget to subscribe and join our growing community of romantics from around the world. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? Now, settle in and let history whisper its most beautiful secrets. This is Tales of Whispering Hearts. There is a particular kind of wisdom that feels, from the inside, exactly like armor. You build it slowly, year by year, from the materials that life provides. Disappointment, adjustment, the gradual and unsentimental education of experience, and eventually it fits so well, sits so comfortably across the chest, that you forget it is armor at all, and begin to think of it simply as yourself. The woman who has been through enough to know better. The woman who has nothing left to be surprised by. The woman who is, in the most complete and self-sufficient sense, finished with needing things she cannot rely on. Harriet Vane was that woman. She was 37 years old, which was, in the England of 1820, old enough to be considered well past the age of romantic consequence. She was a widow of 7 years, a mother of 2 daughters now nearly grown, a woman of modest but independent means, a person of considerable intelligence and settled habits, who had arranged her life with the deliberate and somewhat hard-won satisfaction of someone who has learned that what you make for yourself is far more reliable than what you hope someone else will make for you. She lived in Bath, which suited her. Bath was a city that understood the value of a certain kind of settled life, respectable, orderly, full of good conversation and morning walks and the particular social texture of a place that had been fashionable and was no longer furiously so, and was all the better for it. She had friends there, real ones, the kind accrued over years rather than seasons. She had her daughters, Cecily and Anne, aged 17 and 15, who were the organizing facts of her daily life and the people she loved most in the world. She had her reading and her correspondence, and an involvement with a small lending library that she had helped establish, and which gave her the quiet pleasure of work done well. She was not unhappy. She wanted to be clear about that, because it is important to distinguish between a woman who is unhappy and pretending otherwise, and a woman who is genuinely, substantively content, which Harriet was. She had earned her contentment through the long process of deciding what actually mattered to her and organizing her life around those things, and the result was not exciting, but it was true, and she had come to value true above almost everything else. She had not, in the 7 years since her husband Robert's death, entertained the serious possibility of love. Not because she had closed herself to it with grief or bitterness. Robert had been a good man and a reasonably good husband, and she had mourned him properly and moved forward with her characteristic practicality. But because, at 30, and then 32, and then 35, the opportunities that had presented themselves had been so clearly wrong in one way or another that she had found it easier and truer to remain as she was than to compromise herself for the sake of company. She had, in fact, written a letter to her sister Eleanor 2 years ago, in which she had said quite plainly, "I think I am simply past it, and I find I do not mind." Eleanor had written back with the affectionate skepticism of a younger sister who believed that no one was past it, and that Harriet was being characteristically stubborn about her own happiness. But Harriet had read the letter and smiled and thought, "Eleanor means well, and Eleanor is wrong, and the nicest thing about being 37 is that I am no longer required to pretend otherwise." That was in 1818. In the summer of 1820, Harriet met Nicholas Ashby and discovered that she had been wrong in the way that people are wrong when they have been so thoroughly certain of something for so long that they have stopped checking whether it is still true. She had not expected that. She had, on the whole, stopped expecting things, which, as it turned out, was precisely when they arrived. The circumstances of their meeting were entirely ordinary, which she would later consider perfectly appropriate, because the most significant things in her experience had always arrived dressed as the ordinary, and only revealed themselves to be otherwise once you were already inside them. It was a Tuesday morning in July, and she was at the lending library on Milsom Street, performing the task of cataloguing a new donation of volumes from the estate of a recently deceased local magistrate, which was absorbing work that she was conducting in the small back room with a cup of tea and the focused satisfaction of someone in their natural element. The library's younger assistant, a girl of 18 named Polly, knocked on the door to say that a gentleman had come in asking about a specific edition of Hume's essays that was apparently quite difficult to find in Bath, and would Miss Harriet know if they had it. Harriet went out to the main room because she knew the catalogue better than Polly, and because she was the sort of person who found it easier to come and look than to send information through an intermediary when the information required judgment. The gentleman standing at the front desk was not what she had pictured from Polly's announcement, which had, in its tone, implied someone elderly and academic. He was perhaps 26 or 27, she would later revise this to 28 on better information, with dark hair that wanted cutting and the kind of face that was animated rather than handsome, that looked as though it had a great deal going on behind it and was mostly engaged with the business of the going on rather than with how it appeared to others. He was holding his hat in both hands in the manner of someone who came in with the intention of being quick about it and had not accounted for the detour. "The Hume," Harriet said in the brisk and capable tone she used for library business. "Which edition? The 1758 or the Edinburgh reprint?" He looked at her with the slight recalibration of someone who had expected, from the back room, someone other than a woman who already knew about editions. "The 1758, he said. "The Edinburgh lacks the appendix on the Passions." "It does," she agreed. "We have the 1758. It is on loan at present, due back Thursday." She went to the catalogue, found the entry, confirmed. "I can reserve it for you if you leave your name and direction." "Nicholas Ashby," he said. "I am staying at the Pelican on Walcott Street for another 3 weeks." She wrote it down. He watched her write it down with the expression she noticed, in the spare attention she gave it, of a person who is watching something being done well and finds this interesting. "You are very certain of the catalogue," he said. "I helped build it," she said, without looking up from the ledger. "Ah," he said, in the tone of someone revising an understanding. "Then I have been lucky to find you specifically." She finished the entry and looked up. "Thursday," she said. "Polly will have it at the desk." "Thank you," he said, and left, with the quick, purposeful efficiency of someone who has more things to do and is now free to do them. She went back to the magistrate's volumes and thought nothing more about it. Or rather, she thought almost nothing more about it, which was the first indication, had she been inclined to pay attention to such things, that something had occurred. He came back on Thursday, as confirmed, and collected the Hume, and would have been entirely unremarkable, except that Harriet happened to be in the main room when he arrived, and he said, as he took the volume, "The appendix on the Passions. I was curious whether you had read it." She had. She told him so. "What did you make of it?" he asked, with the directness of someone who asks questions he actually wants answered. She told him what she made of it, which took slightly longer than a library transaction would usually accommodate, and led to a discussion about whether Hume's treatment of reason and feeling as opposites was philosophically coherent, or was instead a rhetorical convenience that had distorted English thinking about the subject for half a century, on which point they disagreed substantially and interestingly. He came back the following Tuesday, not for a book, but with a question about the catalogue that turned out to be a pretext for a further conversation about whether the library had anything by a French philosopher he was interested in, which led to a conversation about the French tradition versus the Scottish, which led to Harriet retrieving 2 volumes she thought bore on the question, and them standing at the desk with the books open between them for 45 minutes, in which she was entirely absorbed and Polly was entirely ignored, which Polly endured with the patient and faintly amused expression of someone who has understood what is happening before the participants have. She did not understand what was happening. She was, she would have said, simply having an interesting conversation. Bath did not offer interesting conversations in the proportion she would have preferred, and when one presented itself, she was not inclined to refuse it on grounds of efficiency. He was an interesting man, clearly well-read, quick-minded, genuinely curious in the way of someone for whom ideas were not social currency but actual sustenance, the kind of person who had formed his own views, and was also genuinely interested in whether yours might improve or complicate them. She found this refreshing. She found him easy to talk to, which was not nothing. She did not, at any point in these early weeks, think of it as anything other than a pleasant and stimulating variation in her routine. She thought about his age, briefly and practically, in the way that she thought about all relevant facts. 27 or 28 to her 37, 10 years approximately. She noted this the way she noted any piece of cataloguing information, accurately, without alarm, and filed it in the category of things that were factually true, and also, in this context, irrelevant, because they were simply two people having conversations about books in a library, and the ages of the people having conversations about books in libraries were not, in her experience, a material consideration. She filed it away. It did not stay filed. Nicholas Ashby had come to Bath for a reason that was less romantic than it sounded, which was that he was writing a book about the philosophy of sympathy, its history, its various treatments from Hutcheson through Smith, through Hume and beyond, and had found that London, where he normally lived, had become too full of people who wanted to talk about the book rather than let him write it. He had come to Bath because a friend had a house there that was currently empty and had offered it to him for the summer, and Bath was quiet enough in July that he could work in the mornings and walk in the afternoons and find enough congenial company in the evenings to prevent the particular solitary madness that descends on people who spend too many consecutive hours alone with an argument that is not yet fully formed. He was 28 years old. He told her this directly. Later, when she asked, the second son of a Norfolk clergyman with intellectual ambitions, a Cambridge fellowship in moral philosophy, and a life that was organized with the purposeful economy of someone who had decided early what mattered and had arranged everything else around it. He had been engaged once, at 24, to a woman who had eventually concluded, correctly, that his primary relationship was with the argument he was constructing at any given time, and that she would always be, in that triangle, the third party. They had parted without much resentment, and he had returned to his work with the focused gratitude of a man who has narrowly avoided making someone else miserable out of the wrong kind of good intentions. He had not been looking for anything in Bath. He had been looking for quiet, and had found, in the lending library on Milsom Street, the exact opposite of quiet, which was a woman who disagreed with his reading of Hume with the specific, evidence-based precision of someone who had thought about it independently and was not going to defer to his professional familiarity with the subject, and who had the most interesting mind he had encountered in 3 years of working in the field. He went back on Thursday because of the Hume. He went back on Tuesday because he wanted to continue the conversation. He went back the Thursday after that because at this point he had stopped requiring a pretext and simply arrived, and the woman behind the desk, who had initially received him with the brisk and capable efficiency of someone who runs a good library and does not need to be bothered, had, gradually, incrementally, in the way of someone who opens a door they did not intend to open and finds themselves already on the other side of it, begun to seem genuinely glad he had come. He noticed this with the pleasure of a man who had not been looking for it and was now, apparently, going to have to reconsider his position. He was not alarmed by the age difference. He was not alarmed by most things, which his mother considered his most interesting quality and his father considered his most exasperating one. He was, however, aware that it was the kind of thing that other people would be alarmed about, and that Harriet Vane was not the kind of woman who was indifferent to the considerations of her situation, which meant that whatever he was beginning to feel needed to be handled with more care than he usually applied to most things. He thought about it while he walked in the afternoons, through the circus and along the Royal Crescent and down the long hill into the lower town, and the thinking did not resolve anything except to confirm what he had already arrived at, which was that the most honest thing he knew about his own nature was that he could not make himself less interested in something genuinely interesting. He had tried in the engagement, and it had produced only unhappiness. He was not going to try again. He would be careful, he would be honest, and he would see what happened. Harriet understood approximately 6 weeks in, on a Wednesday morning, when Nicholas was not at the library, and she noticed his absence in a way she had not anticipated noticing, that something had gone wrong with her filing system. The relevant fact, his age, the 10 years, the category of things that were true and also irrelevant, had not stayed in its category. It had migrated into a different category, which was things that were true and which she was actively thinking about, which was not where she had put it, and which indicated that her filing system had been, without her permission, rearranged. She sat with this for a day, before she did anything as undignified as examine it, because she was not a woman who panicked, and was not going to begin because a man was absent from a library for a Wednesday, and she had noticed. He could be unwell. He could be occupied. He could have finished his research and returned to London, in which case she would be relieved, because it would resolve the question without requiring her to have it. He was not unwell, or occupied, or returned to London. He arrived on Thursday with a book he had found in a second-hand shop on the upper town that he thought bore on the library's gap in French philosophy, and that he had bought, apparently without considering whether this was entirely necessary, because it had seemed like the right thing to do. "You bought us a book," she said. "It was a good price," he said, which was such a transparently insufficient explanation that she almost laughed. "Thank you," she said. "That was thoughtful." He looked at her with the expression she had noticed over the weeks, the one that was not quite the direct and animated look he wore when they were arguing about philosophy, but something quieter underneath it, something that was present in the moments between the arguing, when neither of them was constructing a point, and they were simply in each other's company. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the question you raised last week, about whether sympathy is learned or native. I believe you were right, that I was too quick to cite Smith, as though he were settled on the matter. He isn't." "No," she said, "he isn't. He goes back and forth." "As do I, apparently," he said, with the slight self-deprecating dryness she had come to particularly like when presented with a sufficiently strong argument. She thought, that evening, sitting with her daughters at supper, that she needed to speak to someone about this. Not because she was in distress. She was not in distress. She was in the more uncomfortable condition of clarity, which was that she was aware of what was happening and needed the assistance of someone else's perspective to determine whether she was handling it correctly. She wrote to her sister Eleanor that night. She began, "You will recall the letter I wrote 2 years ago in which I said I was simply past it. I wish to provisionally withdraw that letter." Eleanor's response, which arrived with remarkable speed for a letter from Dorset, said, "I knew it. Tell me everything immediately." Eleanor came to Bath. This was, Harriet reflected, either the best thing she could have done or a catastrophic overreaction to a situation that was not yet a situation, and she could not determine which until Eleanor arrived, and she could see, from her sister's face, whether she was going to be treated with dignity or subjected to the enthusiastic romanticism of a woman who had been married happily for 15 years and had never lost the conviction that everyone else should be also. Eleanor arrived on a Thursday, which meant that she arrived the same afternoon as Nicholas, who was at the library when Eleanor walked in, which Harriet had not planned, and which Eleanor registered in approximately 12 seconds, with the sharpness of someone whose romantic instincts had been honed by a decade and a half of observation. She said nothing then. She was perfectly pleasant to Nicholas, who was perfectly pleasant in return, and the three of them had a brief and unremarkable conversation about a volume he was returning, and then he left, and Eleanor watched him leave, and then turned to Harriet, with an expression that contained multitudes. "He is lovely," Eleanor said. "He is a philosophy fellow from Cambridge," Harriet said, "who is writing a book about sympathy and comes to the library to argue about Hume. He is also," Eleanor said, "clearly very taken with you." "You were here for 4 minutes," Harriet said. "I have been reading faces for 35 years, Eleanor said. "I do not need longer than 4 minutes." They walked to the Crescent that evening, the long way around, which was what they always did when they needed to talk about something properly, and Harriet told Eleanor the whole of it, the Tuesday mornings and the catalogue, and the Hume, and the French philosophy and the 6 weeks, and the Wednesday absence, and the book he had bought from the second-hand shop. Eleanor listened without interrupting, which was unusual for Eleanor, and indicated the seriousness with which she was taking the subject. "You are frightened," Eleanor said, when Harriet finished. "I am cautious," Harriet said. "You are frightened," Eleanor said again, with the gentle firmness of a sister who has known her subject for 35 years. "Which is entirely reasonable, and also entirely unlike the reason you are giving yourself for the caution. You are not being cautious because he is 28. You are frightened because it is real, and real is frightening when you have spent 7 years building a life that does not require you to be vulnerable to anyone." Harriet walked for a moment without answering. The Crescent was above them, golden in the evening, and the city spread below in its orderly, handsome arrangement, and she thought about the word Eleanor had used, vulnerable. She thought about armor, and about wisdom, and about the woman she had described to herself as past it, and who had believed it completely. "He is 28, she said. "Yes," Eleanor said. "I am 37. Yes. The world will have a great deal to say about it." "The world," Eleanor said, "has a great deal to say about everything, and is wrong about most of it. That has never stopped you before." "This is different," Harriet said. "When the world talks about a woman my age, the world talks," Eleanor said, "about a woman who had the courage to want something after 37. which is threatening, which is why the world says what it says. It is not about you, Harriet. It is about the world's discomfort with women who don't stop. She paused. Does he seem to think it is a problem? Harriet thought about the Thursday morning, and the book from the second-hand shop, and the way he had said, "As do I," apparently, with the dry self-awareness of someone who is telling her something about his own reconsideration. "No," she said, "he does not seem to think it is a problem." Then, Eleanor said, with the serene simplicity of a woman who has made her point, "The problem is yours, which means it is also yours to solve." They walked the rest of the way in comfortable silence. Above the city, the sky was moving into its late evening colors, and Bath was very beautiful in the light, and Harriet thought about the woman she was, and the woman she had decided she was, and whether those two women were as much the same as she had always assumed. She thought they might not be. She thought that perhaps the decided version had been, for some time, a more comfortable proposition than the true one, and that comfort and truth were not, had never been, the same thing. She was, she admitted to herself, walking down the hill into Bath in the company of her sister, frightened. And she was also, beneath the armor that had been her companion for 7 years, something else entirely. She was interested. She was alive to something. She was, against every reasonable expectation and every settled conclusion and every letter she had ever written to Eleanor about being simply past it, looking forward to Thursday. She allowed herself to notice this. Barely. Just enough. Nicholas said nothing directly for another 2 weeks, because he was, as Harriet had assessed, a careful man about the things that mattered, and he was not going to say something irreversible in a lending library on a Thursday morning to a woman who had given him, as yet, no clear indication of what she would do with it. He had said enough indirectly. The book, the small adjustments in his schedule that ensured he found reasons to come in on days when he had no particular reason to. But direct was different from indirect, and he knew the difference, and he was waiting. What he was waiting for, he could not have specified precisely, except that he would know it when it arrived. He had found, over the weeks of their acquaintance, that Harriet Vane communicated the important things not with statement, but with attention, that when she was interested in something, she gave it a quality of focus that was entirely distinct from the competent and pleasant attention she gave to everything else, and that the distinction was visible to anyone paying close enough attention to see it. He was paying that close attention. He had been since the first Thursday. She had been giving him that attention for several weeks. He had not yet done anything about it, and he was beginning to feel that not doing anything about it was itself a kind of dishonesty, which he found intolerable, because honesty was the one thing he was not willing to compromise. The occasion that resolved the waiting was a Saturday afternoon in August, when Harriet happened to be walking in Sydney Gardens, and Nicholas happened, for reasons that were approximately 40% genuine and 60% manufactured, to also be walking in Sydney Gardens, and they encountered each other near the canal in the warm afternoon light, with no library desk between them, and no catalogue, and no philosophical question pending. They walked together. It was the first time they had walked together, and the difference between the library conversations, which were contained and purposeful, and walking, which was open and continuous, and required no particular subject to justify itself, was immediately apparent to both of them. They talked for a while about nothing in particular, which was new, not argument, not debate, simply two people in each other's company, finding that the company itself was enough. And then they fell into a silence that could have been the comfortable silence of familiarity, or the charged silence of something unresolved, and Harriet thought that it was both, and Nicholas thought the same thing, and they walked another 50 yards without speaking, and then he said, without having planned the exact moment, "I want to say something. I want to say it carefully, and I want you to hear it as I intend it, which is without pressure and without expectation of anything particular in return." Harriet kept walking. She did not look at him. "Say it," she said. "I came to Bath to write," he said, "and I have written very little for 6 weeks, which by the standards of my usual productivity represents an enormous disruption. I want you to know that I do not consider this a complaint. It is in fact the opposite." She said nothing. Her pace did not change. "I have been trying to determine," he said, "whether what I am experiencing is something I should mention to you, or something I should simply absorb quietly and let the end of August resolve, without either of us having to do anything awkward. I have concluded that the quiet absorption is not honest, and dishonesty for me is not really available as an option." He paused. I think about you, not in the way I think about an interesting philosophical problem, though you are also that. In the way that makes me find reasons to be in a library on a Tuesday when I do not need a book. She was quiet for a moment. They had reached a bench near the water, and she stopped walking and sat down on it, which he took as an invitation, and sat beside her, a respectable distance, looking at the canal. You are 28, she said. Yes, he said. I am 37. I know, he said. I have known since the third Tuesday. You told me how long you had been at the library, and I calculated. He paused. I did not find it discouraging. I want to be honest about that. She was quiet for a long time. The water moved in the canal with the slow, patient motion of water that has no urgency and is simply itself. I have 2 daughters, she said. Cecily is 17. Anne is 15. I know, he said. You have mentioned them. They sound formidable. They are, she said. I am their mother, and that is the first thing I am and will always be. Yes, he said. I understand that. I have built a life, she said, that is genuinely mine. I am not dissatisfied with it. I am not sitting in it hoping for rescue. I want you to understand that, because I will not be managed or arranged or made into someone's project, and I will not give up what I have built for something that does not deserve the cost. I know, he said. I have been watching you for 6 weeks. I know exactly what you are. I am not asking you to give up anything. I am telling you what is true and leaving the rest to you, because you are the most capable person I have met in a long time, and the decision of what to do with a true thing is entirely yours to make. Harriet looked at the water. She thought about the armor. She thought about the letter to Eleanor. She thought about what Eleanor had said about women who don't stop, and about the world's discomfort with them. She thought about Robert, who had been good and reasonably good, and had not seen her in the way that mattered. She thought about Cecily and Anne, and the life on Milsom Street, and the magistrate's volumes, and the lending library catalogue that she had built herself. She thought about the man sitting beside her, who had said, I am telling you what is true, and leaving the rest to you, which was the most accurately pitched thing anyone had ever said to her, because it was entirely correct. The rest was hers to make, and he had understood that, and offered accordingly. She thought about being frightened. She thought about how frightened and wrong were not the same thing, which Eleanor had said, and which she had known intellectually for years, and was only now, sitting beside a canal in Sydney Gardens in August, beginning to know otherwise. I need time, she said. Yes, he said. I am not going to be rushed, or managed, or persuaded by charm. I know, he said. I am not attempting any of those things. I am also, she said, after a pause, not dismissing what you have said. I want you to know that. He looked at her then, and she allowed herself to look back, and the look that passed between them was not the look of a woman who was managing something and a man who was waiting. It was the look of 2 people who have said true things and are now in the space that true things create, which is not comfortable and is also, unmistakably, alive. Then I will wait, he said, without pressure. And I will continue to come to the library on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and we will continue to argue about the Scottish Enlightenment, and you will continue to know the catalogue better than I do, and whatever you decide will be the right thing, because it will be yours. She looked back at the water. That is a very patient position, she said. You are worth being patient about, he said simply. She said nothing, but she did not contradict it, which for Harriet Vane was its own kind of answer. The month that followed was the most honestly examined month of Harriet's life, which was a significant claim for a woman who had been examining herself honestly for 37 years. She examined it the way she examined everything, methodically, without self-pity, with full attention to the things that were actually there, rather than the things she wished were there, or feared were there. She spoke to Cecily first, which surprised her daughter. Cecily was 17, and had her mother's intelligence and her father's temperament, which was to say she was sharp and warm, and slightly alarming in the precision of her perception, and she listened to Harriet's careful and somewhat circuitous account of Mr. Ashby and the lending library with the focused attention of someone assembling a picture from its parts. He is younger than you, Cecily said. Yes, Harriet said. 9 years. Cecily considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Do you like him? She asked. Not in the library way, in the other way. Harriet looked at her eldest daughter. Yes, she said. Does he treat you well? Exceptionally, Harriet said. He is honest and patient, and has never once said anything that was calculated to manage me, which is rarer than it should be. Cecily nodded, as though this answered the question. Then I don't understand what the difficulty is, she said. He is 28, Harriet said. I am 37. People will talk, Cecily said, with the magnificent impatience of 17. People always talk. They talked when Papa died, and they talked when you took the lending library work, and they talked when you didn't remarry within 2 years, the way they expected. They will talk about this, and then they will find someone else to talk about. She looked at her mother steadily. Are you happy when you are with him? Harriet was quiet for a moment. She thought about the Tuesday mornings and the canal, and the way the hour at the library desk always felt shorter than it was. Yes, she said. Then I think, Cecily said, with the decisive calm of someone who has never learned to be afraid of her own opinions, that you should stop worrying about other people's arithmetic and pay attention to that. Anne's response, when Harriet spoke to her, was characteristically and entirely Anne, which was to ask approximately 27 questions about Nicholas's intellectual interests and family and character, and at the end of them to declare, with the comprehensive certainty of 15 years and a very good mind, that he sounded like someone worth knowing, and that the age question was stupid, and that she didn't understand why her mother was making it complicated, and then to go back to her book. Harriet sat in her daughter's wake and felt, with some astonishment, that two young people who had not yet learned the weight of convention had seen the thing more clearly than she had. She wrote to Eleanor that evening, "My daughters have resolved the question more efficiently than either of us." Eleanor wrote back the next morning, "Obviously, they have your mind and have not yet learned to distrust it." She thought about that, about learning to distrust her own mind, about all the ways that wisdom, accumulated at cost over years, had taught her to add caveats to her own instincts, to check the impulse against the calculation, to file things in the category of things to be managed, rather than things to be felt. She had called this prudence. She was beginning to wonder if it was, in part, something less admirable, a kind of preemptive self-protection, the refusal to try something that might fail, dressed in the respectable clothing of experience. She sat with this for 2 more weeks, because she was who she was, and 2 weeks was the minimum she required for a conclusion of this kind, and at the end of the 2 weeks, she had arrived at something she could call, without exaggeration, a decision. She went to him. Not to the library, which was her territory. She went to the house on Walcott Street, where he had extended his stay well past the 3 weeks he had originally planned, which she knew, because Polly had mentioned it in passing, with the innocent precision of someone who is definitely not tracking the situation. She knocked on the door on a Tuesday morning in September, when the summer was beginning to turn, and the air in Bath had that first autumnal quality, the one that is not cold, but is no longer quite warm, the one that belongs entirely to itself. He opened the door himself. The house was his friend's, and came without staff beyond a daily woman, and she saw, in the moment before his expression organized itself, the thing she had been watching for, and had not known she was watching for, which was the uncalculated version of his feeling about seeing her. It was brief, a second, perhaps less, but it was entirely real, and entirely without arrangement, and it told her everything the 2 weeks of examination had been building toward. Harriet, he said, not Mrs. Vane, not any of the titles they had been navigating around. Her name, simply, as though it were a thing he had been saying in private for some time. "I have something to say," she said. "May I come in?" He stood back from the door, and she came in, into the hallway of the borrowed house, with its comfortable disorder, and the smell of books, and the particular atmosphere of a place where someone has been working seriously, and he led her into the sitting room, and neither of them sat down. She had rehearsed this, which was characteristic, and she was now, in the event, not going to use the rehearsed version, which was also characteristic, because the rehearsed version was the managed one, and she had decided, somewhere in the 2 weeks, that the managed version was precisely what she was done with. She said, "I have spent 2 weeks determining whether I trust what I feel enough to say it, which you deserve to know, because it tells you something about how seriously I have taken it. I have concluded that I do. I trust it. Not because it is convenient, or because the timing is right, or because I have solved the questions of age and arithmetic and what people will say, because I have not solved those things and they are real and some of them will matter, but because the alternative, not saying it, filing it in the acceptable disappointments category, and continuing as I was, felt, when I held it honestly, like a choice I would spend the rest of my life regretting. and I have too much self-respect to make that choice simply because it is safer. He was looking at her with the completely still attention that she had learned over the summer was his highest form of being present. "I am not easy," she said. "I am 37, and I have daughters and opinions, and a life I have built carefully, and I will not dismantle it for anything that does not deserve it. I am also, apparently, in love with you, which I have been resisting acknowledging for approximately 6 weeks, and am now done resisting." He looked at her for a moment in the sitting room of the borrowed house, with the autumn light coming through the windows, and his face had the expression she had been watching for, without knowing she was watching, the unmanaged and entirely real version. "Harriet," he said, for the second time, as though the name were enough. And then, because it was not quite enough, "I have been in love with you since the 3rd Thursday, when you told me that Hume's treatment of reason and feeling as opposites was a rhetorical convenience that had distorted English thinking for half a century, and said it with the absolute confidence of someone who had arrived at it independently and was not going to be moved by the authority of my professional opinion. I thought, that is a person I have been looking for, without knowing I was looking." She looked at him. She thought about armor, and about wisdom, and about the woman who had written to Eleanor that she was simply past it, and had believed it completely. And she thought about Cecily's magnificent 17-year-old impatience, and Anne's 27 questions, and Eleanor's knowing arrival on a Thursday, and Lady Agatha's long-ago advice, and all the various people who had seen, before she had, that the decided version of herself was not quite the same as the true one. She thought, "I have been wrong about myself before. I prefer the version that is corrected," she said. "Then I think we should stop wasting Tuesdays." He smiled. The full and unguarded version, the one she had been cataloguing for 6 weeks, and she smiled back. The version that had nothing managed in it, the version that her daughters would have recognized immediately as the truest one, the one that arrived before permission. They sat down, side by side in the borrowed sitting room with the autumn coming through the windows, and began the first conversation that was not the library version, not brisk, not purposeful, not bounded by catalogue and closing time, but the actual one, with all its complications and its genuine requirements, and its extraordinary, inconvenient, entirely real promise. The autumn of 1820 was, in Harriet's private accounting, the best autumn of her adult life, which she noted with some surprise and a great deal of satisfaction. She had not expected it. She had stopped expecting best autumns sometime around 1815, which had not been a conscious decision, but was the accumulated result of a life that had required more management than spontaneity, and the discovery that expectations she had quietly laid down were capable of being picked back up was one of the more pleasant discoveries of 37. They were careful with the form of things. Harriet was not a woman who ignored form. She had daughters whose reputations were a consideration, and a position in Bath society that mattered to her modestly but genuinely, and she was not going to throw any of those things away in the enthusiasm of a newly acknowledged feeling. They moved slowly in the public ways that counted, received each other in the company of others, made no announcements before there was something to announce, and conducted themselves with the restraint that Harriet's situation required and Nicholas's patience accommodated without complaint. In the private ways that did not require form, they were less restrained, which is to say they talked, continuously and without much regard for the hour, about everything, philosophy and daughters and the management of a lending library and the particular loneliness of writing a book that is not yet finished, and the Surrey landscape where she had grown up, and the Norfolk one where he had, and what they each thought about the nature of sympathy, which was his subject professionally, and turned out, in the conversations between them, to be a subject that had been running quietly under all of it from the first. He was, as she had assessed, which was a relief, not a different person in private than in the library, not managing a version for her consumption. What was true in the library was true in the sitting room and on the walks and in the letters they wrote to each other when he went back to Cambridge in October, which were long and frequent, and conducted with the same combination of argument and honesty that had been their natural register from the beginning. Cecily met him at a Sunday supper in October, and conducted him through a thorough and only slightly terrifying interrogation about his views on female education and his intentions toward her mother, from which he emerged, Harriet thought, with considerable credit, having answered both with the direct and thoughtful honesty that was simply his way, and that Cecily recognized and respected immediately. Anne asked him about the philosophy of sympathy, and whether he had considered its relationship to justice, which led to a 2-hour conversation that Harriet watched with the particular warmth of a mother watching her child be genuinely met. And afterward, Anne told her, with the finality of 15, that she approved, which Harriet received with more relief than she would have admitted to anyone but Eleanor. Eleanor, informed of all developments by letter, was transparently delighted and said so at length in return post. He asked her in December, in the Milsom Street Library after closing, with Polly long gone and the candles low, and the catalogue she had built over 3 years, the silent and appropriate witness to the beginning of the thing. He had the ring, a simple one, which he had chosen with the accuracy of someone who had been paying attention, exactly the kind she would have chosen herself. He asked with the directness and honesty that he brought to everything, which was to say, he did not perform the asking, but said, plainly, that he wanted to marry her, that he understood what it meant to marry a woman with daughters, and a life already fully formed, and a mind that would not be arranged, and that he wanted all of it, not despite the fullness, but because of it. She said yes without a long silence, which was unlike her, and she noted it, the speed of it, the way it came before the usual consultation of her own caution, and thought, there, that is the true one, the one that comes before permission. They were married in March, in the Bath church where she had attended Sunday services for 6 years, in the company of Cecily, and Anne, and Eleanor, and a small gathering of the friends who were real ones. The world said what the world said, which was quite a lot, for approximately 6 weeks, and then subsided when the next thing arrived to be discussed, which Eleanor had predicted, and which turned out to be precisely true. Nicholas finished the book in the first year of their marriage, which she considered a point of particular pride, not because she had written it, but because she had, on several important occasions, told him the argument was not yet right, in ways that resulted in it becoming more right, and he had thanked her for this in the book's acknowledgements, with a precision and warmth that made the Bath Lending Library entirely worth its subscription price to anyone who wished to read it. Cecily married 3 years later, a steady and good young man who was overwhelmed by her and had the sense to appreciate rather than resent it. Anne went to Edinburgh to study, which was unconventional and entirely characteristic, and wrote home letters of great length and greater intellectual excitement. Harriet read each of them with the specific pride of a mother who has watched her daughter become someone without interfering in the becoming. Nicholas never once tried to manage her, not in the years of the marriage, not in the arguments that were real and occasionally loud and productive, not in the decisions about the library or Cecily or Anne, or the direction of her charitable work. He offered his thinking when she asked for it, and held his peace when she didn't, and met her as she was on every ordinary Tuesday of their life together, which was the exact thing she had not known she needed, and had, against every settled conviction and filed away conclusion and letter written to Eleanor about being past it, been offered. She thought sometimes about the armor. She thought about how thoroughly she had believed in it, how completely it had felt like herself rather than a thing she was wearing, and how strange it was that a man in a lending library asking about an edition of Hume had been, without either of them knowing it, the thing that showed her the difference. She was not past it. She had never been past it. She had simply been, very thoroughly and with great intelligence and considerable self-discipline, wearing armor and calling it wisdom, and she had needed someone to be genuinely interested in what was underneath before she had any reason to take it off. She was glad, in the end, that she had. She was glad that she had written the letter to Eleanor, and that Eleanor had come, and that Cecily had said, "Pay attention to that," with the magnificent impatience of 17, and that she had walked to Walcott Street on a September morning and said what was true before she could make herself not say it. She was glad that love had arrived not when she was young and unguarded and expected it, but when she was 37 and wise and armored and completely unprepared, which was, she had come to understand, precisely the right time. Not because it was comfortable, it was not comfortable, but because she had, by 37, become someone who could actually receive it, someone who knew what she was offering and what she required, and who was not going to give it to someone who did not deserve it, and who had, in Nicholas Ashby on a Thursday morning in a lending library with a Hume edition in his hand, found someone who did. She thought that was, all things considered, a very good outcome for a woman who had been completely, entirely, and as it turned out, not at all correctly convinced that she was finished with needing things she could not rely on. She was not finished. She had, in fact, barely begun. And so ends tonight's tale. She was older, wiser, and completely unprepared for love. A story about the particular armor that wisdom builds, and the particular courage it takes to take it off. About a woman who had organized her life so well and so honestly that she had forgotten to leave room for the things she had stopped expecting. About a man who saw through the armor, not by force, but by the simple, patient act of being genuinely interested in what was underneath. A story about daughters who saw clearly what their mother was afraid to see. About a sister who drove to Bath on a Thursday. About the difference between wisdom and self-protection, which can look identical from the outside and feel entirely different from within. And most of all, a story about the most unexpected kind of love, the kind that arrives not at 22, but at 37. Not when you are open and hopeful, but when you have arranged everything so that nothing can get through, and it gets through anyway, because the right person always does. And now, our question for you tonight. If you were Harriet, if you had built a life that was genuinely yours, genuinely good, and genuinely enough, would you have had the courage to risk it? Would you have walked to Walcott Street that September morning and said what was true? Or would you have let the end of August resolve it and returned to the life you had made and told yourself it was wisdom? Tell me what you would do if it were you in that story. We read every single comment, and we love hearing from you more than you know. If tonight's tale moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe to Tales of Whispering Hearts so you never miss a new story. Share this with someone who has been telling themselves they are past it, because they are not. No one is past it. Love arrives on its own schedule, with no interest whatsoever in our arrangements. Until next time, may you have the courage to take the armor off. Just once, just enough to let something true in. This has been Tales of Whispering Hearts.